presentation. As I was listening to the presentation, I've realized that we are quite behind our schedule. We have to conclude the first session by 4:15 now, and I would like to give 6 minutes to each discussant to go over today's presentation. First, Professor Park Yoonsoo.
Am I supposed to give the discussion while I'm seated? Will that be okay? Well, thank you very much. The two speakers have already mentioned many important things, and let me just express my views in four areas. First of all, in order to identify or precisely evaluate the project effectiveness, the best way is not after the work is completed, but from the time of designing that project itself. Let me re-emphasize that. The process of evaluating the project, let me compare that with the cook, how they cook. Even though the cook is the best one in the whole world, if the raw materials are not so good, then the dishes cannot be perfect. So once again, if the design is poorly made, then coming up with evaluations of the effectiveness of the project is extremely difficult. That means at the best five-star restaurants, I heard that they freely express their views so that they can come up with the best dishes they can possibly provide. So from the very beginning of designing the project itself, they need to collaborate and then come up with a perfect design so that the effectiveness can be promoted. I sincerely hope that we need to create an environment where the effectiveness can be guaranteed. When they express their views, we should not distort or damage the purpose of the project itself. We have to have a perfect understanding of the project, and creativity must be guaranteed. That is why, once again, the relevant ministries and also the evaluator needs to once again collaborate from the very beginning stage. Second, giving the incentive or the issue of the incentive by the ministries, no one would like to get criticized or being evaluated, which means that if a certain ministry receive an evaluation, if the result is good, then it's nothing. But if the bad result is produced, then everything will be really severely hampered. So there must be some systematic support when we conduct evidence-based policy evaluation, especially in conducting the feasibility study. We do have that. If the project is more than 50 billion budget, then there must be a feasibility study. This is a very rare practice, and many countries around the world are quite envious of the systems that we have, and especially the social policies. There must be a feasibility study before we execute the budget. And once again, I strongly believe that the policy must be well guaranteed. The third area is, as you already heard, the budget cycle is usually 1 year. And within that 1 year, when we design the project and then we implement that, and the result should be reflected for the next year's project. But sometimes the budget cycle 1 year, it's impossible to change the cycle itself because budget cycle itself is the fundamental of the nation's fiscal policy. But what we can try is, for example, we have the laws and regulations, especially Article 15 said that if the project is not based on the presidential decree, then budget cycle must be 3 years. So when there is 1 year passes by after that, then there must be an evaluation, and systematically there is a clause like that. And why don't we use this? So, which means that we can definitely use this, and then evaluation can be done. So once again, we can systematically operate this. Lastly, my recommendation is experimental-based policy evaluation is mostly post-project. But the result of the post-project, if we do have accumulations of the project result, then definitely we can apply this result, and then we can also expect the result of the project in advance. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we would like to invite Professor Oh Youngmin. Thank you for the two wonderful presentations. Evidence-based policy decisions and evaluation is a very challenging thing to do properly. But there has been a lot of discussion in the academia, and I'm sure such discussions can set the stage for successful introduction of evidence-based policy evaluation in Korea. And let me summarize what has been presented. In terms of guideline, the most important thing, in my opinion, is because of various challenges in implementation, setting the guideline or the criteria would be the most challenging thing to do. And as for the feasibility, ethical issues, legal issues, data accumulation, data usability issues, all of these issues should be considered together to select the appropriate projects. And of course, there has always been some difficulties related to experiments. And we could also use a lot of variety of quasi-experiment methods. In Korea, we are providing a lot of subsidies, and we could provide a lot of education programs for qualification of those who are receiving the subsidies, and we could do proper score matching system. And next, as for one of the bottleneck of implementation is that this is an experiment targeting people, so ethical issues must be resolved, and IRB, well, in natural science, IRB is quite sophisticated, but it is not so sophisticated in the social science areas. So as for the rules, approaches, and targets, we need to be more specific. And last but not least, in the experiment process, in order to get the feasibility of experiments, there are various biases, errors like historical effects, spillover effects that can contaminate the results. So we need to find a way to overcome such biases or errors in evidence-based policy evaluation and make them reflected in the guidelines so that we can reduce the sources of such concern. Regarding the second presentation, this was about the limitations or potential of evidence-based policy evaluation in budget process, and preliminary feasibility studies and pilot assessment are done. And line ministries are not quite welcoming for pilot or the policy experiments. They seem to think of it as an instrument to expand to the main program. So in order to overcome such problems, I think we need to find a way to combine it with preliminary feasibility studies. And when there is a need for large-scale budget, and when policy experiment is possible, then it can be combined with preliminary feasibility system studies or pilot programs. If they are evaluated in a scientific way, they can be exempt from cost-effectiveness evaluation. So if such incentives can be designed, I'm sure we will see more policy experiments. Last but not least, we have talked about ex-ante policy evaluation, and I believe this is quite critical. And in-depth physical study is something that is done in Korea. However, most of the evaluation is done in a non-experimental way. So we should look for ways to apply experimental methods here. And when it comes to control groups, you said that there is a focus on identifying the control groups, but we can also have diverse treatment group as an alternative. When there is unclear effectiveness of policies, then we can assess the project and then we can design different approaches for the project implementation and then evaluate the effectiveness in an ex ante manner. Thank you very much.
네. 마지막으로
Last but not least, we have with us fellow Dr. Oh Jung from the Employment Policy Research Division of Korea Labor Institute. Thank you very much to speakers and to discussant. Well, my discussion actually overlap with the two previous discussants, but as Professor Park Yoonsoo mentioned, from the stage of designing, we must consider the issue of the evaluation. I totally agree. But one additional comment is, during the Professor Kim Boo-yeol's presentation, in order to conduct policy evaluation, we need to guarantee the independency of the third party who can conduct the evaluation. So from the beginning of the designing all the way to completing the evaluation, the third party must do it. Of course, the designing stage can influence greatly to the result of the project. That is why I totally agree that the third party must conduct the policy evaluation. And other than the evaluation itself, overhaul, we need to guarantee the third party who has the legitimacy as well as the independency. Now, second speaker talked about some limitation, and we can see that the issue of the fiscal year was also mentioned. And also not only the matching of the fiscal year and also the designing of the policy itself, but due to the political issues, most of the policies are rapidly made. And instead of introducing new thing, we need to improve the current policy that could be desirable. For example, regarding the subsidy, of course, we have this 3-year sunset clause, but also we don't do the precisely accurately the evaluation, but during that period, when we conduct the experiment, based on the result of the experiment, we can decide the directions of the improvement of the policy. There's much room for that. And in light of that, we need to prevent any kind of the waste of the budget itself or expenditure, and the result of the experiment, instead of coming up with the decision, we need to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of the policy. But how can we determine the range of the policymaker? What about the detailed contents? We need to decide that as well. And I believe right now, in order to enhance the utility, the most important thing is coming up with the specific ideas, and policy designs and policy evaluation is extremely important direction. And also, these are the things that we cannot prevent. And of course, deciding the improvement directions, we cannot just utilize the policy, but from the stage of introducing the policy, we need to start evaluating the policy itself. And for that, as it was mentioned by Professor Kim and Dr. Lee, we need to come up with a more systematic approach in order to conduct the experiment. RCT group itself, we cannot determine that. Yes, I understand that coming with a comparison group, we cannot create out of blue, but from the trial basis or from the designing stage, we need to find out what's the most optimal way and then choose the comparison group and then conduct the test. And as it was mentioned, the policy itself, because of the political reasons, sometimes it's decided, and in order to resolve the current pending issues, a policy is suddenly introduced. That is why I believe the pilot project needs to be reviewed, and then from the designing stage, we need to come up with the evaluation, and based on the experiment result, we need to make sure that the budget is spent, and that kind of process is required. And also, just like a feasibility study, we need to think about the budget scale, and we can apply the budget. And also, after we conduct the pilot projects and then ask for the budget, that kind of system also needs to be introduced. In light of that, what Professor Kim Buyol mentioned, that 50% of the policy itself is quite important. Policy importance is about 50%, and also the comparison group or the counterfactual issue takes about 50%. But not every single policy requires experiment or can be proved. So we need to decide whether the policy requires evaluation or not. In case of the SOC projects, conducting the evaluation itself is almost impossible. But in case of the social policy, yes, evaluation must be done in the designing stage. Last but not least, I do have some time left, so let me add. Designing the policy and evaluating the policy, we need to introduce a systems to find out whether the policy is well complied or not. In foreign country, this compliance is very important. For example, in case of the labor market, signing the standard contract or whether the certain party complies with the minimum wage or not, they try to understand the compliance is well done or not. The reason why such thing is important is because we need to scientifically evidence-based policy evaluation possible why such compliance was not conducted. Not only understanding the current status is important, but also we can minimize unnecessary waste, and also the conducting the evaluation sometime causes some extra cost for the employer. In case of the US, such evaluation is guaranteed. For example, in order to understand the discriminations of the races in houses, they regularly conduct such evaluations and experiment. And according to the Fair Housing Act, such experimental evaluation is guaranteed. In Korea, we need to introduce a certain law or regulations to guarantee such experimental evaluation. And during the conference that we are having today, in order to introduce the experimental evaluation, we can think about feasibility study or things that cannot be done through the feasibility study. We can prove the effectiveness and efficiency, and for that, a system must be introduced. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So we have heard from three discussants. I would like to ask the two presenters to comment about the discussants' comments. I would like to give 2 minutes to each presenter.
네,
Thank you for the discussion, and thank you very much. First, Professor Park Yoonsoo mentioned that from the stage of checking out whether the food ingredients are proper or not, and then cook is extremely appropriate example. And also among the comment made by Professor Oh, let me just answer. Not only the experimental policy evaluation, but all kinds of things is necessary, like semi or quasi experiment is also important, and also the regression discontinuity design is also important. But the randomized control trial or quasi experimental, like we can choose the matching for the comparison group between the researchers and also the ministries working together, or the pains and sufferings, time and efforts are all same. And how can we well coordinate is extremely important. Personally, what I felt is that from the very beginning, experimental policy evaluation was almost impossible. There were huge prejudice about this, perceptions. But why do we always interpret that experimental policy evaluation is impossible? We can do that because quasi-experimental evaluation and also experimental policy evaluation, it's all same. We need to put our efforts, we need to have the discussions, everything's same. And of course, in case of the quasi-experimental policy evaluation, yes, we also need a lot of efforts. So considering every element, both process requires efforts and time, then why don't we, from the very beginning, select a good food ingredient so that we can come up with a best dishes in order to prove of excellent scientific basis. That is why I strongly suggest that we need to conduct a experimental policy evaluation. And Dr. Oh, I totally agree with your discussions. All kinds of projects cannot be evaluated in an experimental way. So I have given the 4 guidelines. The first guideline is whether the relevance of the government intervention is important, and I have given 10% of that. And the relevance of government intervention on top of that, we need to find out whether it can be done by the experimental or quasi-experimental. And if I add that, I believe Dr. Oh's comment can be well reflected. Thank you.
I believe the 3 discussants have talked about the need to formalize policy experiments for evidence-based policy evaluation, and I fully agree with that. But on the other hand, preliminary feasibility study is usually done for large-scale projects, and introducing policy experiments for preliminary feasibility studies is possible when there is a strong support from the academia or consensus from the academia. So before that, we could have some successful smaller cases. So we need to be successful with smaller projects first before we apply that to large-scale projects. After we build some experience and expertise by participating in small-scale projects, I think we'll be in a better position to do this for large-scale projects. So evidence-based policy evaluation is already adopted, but not done widely enough with limited systematic support. But this will be done eventually, and I believe there will be a lot more evidence-based policy evaluation to be done in the future. I would like to thank the speakers and discussants for joining us for this session. So I would like to conclude the first session now. Thank you very much.